today's video, I'll be showing you guys how I create my product experiments to test assumptions I have about my users, which then informs what I build for my product. This is part of the build, measure, learn feedback loop, specifically the build phase. And it comes before you build something because you want to make sure that you have certain viewpoints on what your users want and don't want, and then make sure you're organized on that front so you don't end up just creating feature after feature without really understanding if those features are part of what your users want. Your users don't know what they want, and you at the start probably don't know what your users want as well. So part of the process of building something people want is first having a set of assumptions about your users, specifically their behaviors. And all this comes down to observing user behavior and a structured process of observing that behavior in action, which is why product experiments, or at least what I call product experiments, you can call them product hypotheses, are so important. So let me show you what exactly I mean by product experiments. And to show you what I mean, I'll be using Trello, which is a software that a lot of startups use, and I use it with my co-founder because it's a great way to collaborate and to make sure we're on the same page when it comes to progress in the product. And I'll just dive right into it and show you guys what I mean. So as you can see, there is a first iteration card, and this is how I like to structure my product development process. It's about iterations. So right now we're still in the first iteration of the product. And under this first iteration card, I like to create checklists to track the work we're doing. So on my end, since I'm on the non-technical side of things, I'm on the product side of things, I have my own checklist and it's called product hypotheses. And as you can see, there's only one product hypothesis that I'm currently testing, which is users already have a network, giving them the ability to easily reach out to every person in that network to ask for intros. Might be a good way to get warm intros to people who are hiring. To give you some context, the startup I'm doing with my co-founder has to do with helping people with their job search. And right now we're still searching for product market fit, which is why we're still in the product hypothesis testing phase and not really the let's go all out and build all these features phase. And as you can see, I have one product hypothesis right now, and it has to do with developing the product and how exactly it links to behaviors that we currently see with our users. And if we break this down right now, as you can see, there are specific components to let's just break this down. Break down this this assumption that I have about my users. So, users already have a network. That is more of an observed fact and not really an assumption, but it could be depending on the user you're going for. So for us, we're going for people who are already in their first or second job in their careers and are looking for another job. So from that, we can assume that this is a fact. They already have an established network from their workplace. And then the second portion of this is giving them the ability to easily reach out to every person in that network to ask for intros. Might be a good way to get warm intros to people who are hiring. Now that is an assumption that we're making about our users. We're assuming that if we give them the ability to reach out to everyone in their network in a scalable way, it will make it much easier to find a job, because we're assuming that our users, once they hear back from some people in their network, will jump onto these intros and then try to get interviews in that way, because at the end of the day, we can't carry out the whole job search interaction. They have to take the next few steps after we help them take the first steps. So that's an assumption we're making about behavior. And now the part about testing is, now we're gonna create a feature. We're gonna create a feature that allows our users to do exactly this. Maybe some scalable way of en masse reaching out to every single person in their network. And then we want to see if the feedback we get is our users coming back to us and telling us, hey, I actually heard back from all these people in my network. This is great. This is actually helping me with my job search. That would be a validated assumption. The assumption that giving our users the ability to reach out to everyone in their network overall the assumption really is we're assuming that outreach actually helps with their job search. And to break it down even more, we're assuming that reaching out to people in your network helps with your job search. That is the assumption we're testing, and we want to see if our users think that way as well. This product experiment, this feature or whatever minimal feature then we decide to create to test this assumption we have about your users, we want to see if these minimal features produce the benefits that we think our users will get, or at least we're assuming that our users will get from the feature we're trying to create. So to break things down into simpler terms, a product experiment at the end of the day really just comes down to, of course, a view about your user and what they might benefit from. Then you should also have some inclusion of facts about your user that you know to be true, and then something that you don't know is true yet but think is true, which is really the assumption you're trying to make. So have a view about what your user might benefit from, which is part of what you don't know yet in terms of which is so have a view about your user and what you think they might benefit from, and then make sure that you are actually testing something, that you're actually taking a leap of faith, thinking to yourself, okay, I don't know if this is true right now, but I think it might be beneficial to our users, so I'm going to create an experiment, create maybe a couple of really minimal features to try to test if my theory about my users and what they find beneficial is true. That, at the end of the day, is what a product experiment attempts to do. It attempts to test if your view of what your users think is beneficial is accurate or not. Now, just a word of warning. Just because you can run multiple product experiments at once doesn't mean you should run multiple product experiments at once. Ideally, you want to run 2, at most 3, especially if you're in a small team, because when it comes to product experiments, building the features is only part of the battle. You also have the measure and learn phases of the build, measure, learn feedback loop. Building is only part of the process. Measuring comes down to understanding what kind of feedback you're getting from the features you released to potential users that you recruited. And then learning is understanding if the feedback you've gotten actually validates your assumption at the start and actually validates what you've built for your users. Measuring and learning can take quite a long time. And the best thing to do is not to multitask, to not be building this and then measuring here and then learning there, because then you get kind of jumbled up. And then you also, when you run into issues, you're going to start going down the rabbit hole of a backlog of issues. Like let's say you run 3 product experiments. So you have experiment 1, experiment 2, and then experiment 3. Let's say for experiment 1, you're in the build phase. Here you've built, and now you're in the measure phase. And then for experiment 3, you've built, you've measured, and now you're in the learn phase. But then let's say you encounter a bug, okay? You encounter some sort of blocker. Then you have to address this, right? But then you're in the measuring phase. So then you have to move from here to here. And then when you're in the learning phase here, you have to move from here back to the blocker. And then as you can see, you just have all these issues. You have to focus on this as well. And you just don't know what to prioritize. At the end of the day, what happens if you have more than, let's say, 3 product experiments is that you just have a whole bunch, a mishmash of work that you have to do. And honestly, when you're trying to move fast and when you're trying to validate the learning, when you're trying to validate assumptions you have about your users, ideally you don't want to be jumping around between product experiments. You want to be validating one assumption or invalidating it and then moving on to the next product experiment, being very patient in this process. Don't rush it. I can sometimes rush this process. And when you rush, you just take away so much from how effective the build, measure, learn feedback loop can be. You just take away from the effectiveness of this concept. So based on my recommendation, I would just recommend 2, maybe 3 product experiments to run at one time, and keep those experiments short. Don't try to have lengthy product development cycles where you just create all these random features and then try to learn from every single one of them. Chances are you won't, because your engineers will be overflowing with work, and then you will also be overflowing with managerial tasks. And it's just not a good way to iterate quickly when it comes to building an early stage product. So that's it, guys, for how to run a product experiment. It's a pretty simple process, and really the key to running a good product experiment is being very clear about the assumption you made about your user, and then being clear about what exactly you're going to do to test that assumption, and then after that being clear on how exactly to measure the feedback you're getting from the feature you've built to test the assumption that you had initially, and then have some process for learning from the feedback that you've gotten. So at the end of the day, if I could summarize the whole product experiment cycle, it would be: first, have an assumption, so assume. Then you want to build quickly. Then you want to test with your users. And then you want to measure feedback. Then you want to learn. Correct or not correct? Usually takes around, for us, it's 3 weeks to a month for one cycle. So that's it, guys, for how to run a product experiment. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below. And that's it for this video. I hope you guys learned something about how to run product experiments and can now finally apply the build, measure, learn feedback loop to your own product development cycles.